not going to answer the question.
Why wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
The question is, the question
Supreme Court
is,
Justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who?
United we stand, divided we fall. And if our back should ever be against the wall, we'll be together, you and I.
The president's like every kid we knew in every class along the way who thought he was the smartest guy in the room and needed to share that with you on a frequent basis. It was a grating and irritating characteristic.
Explained that I never thought Donald Trump would embrace my vision, but I did hope, for the sake of the country, that he might show some interest in taking the job seriously. But it hasn't happened. He hasn't shown any interest in doing the work.
Don't talk to me that way. You're just a lightweight.
Oh, the poor folks hate the rich folks, and the rich folks hate the poor folks. All of my folks hate all of your folks. It's American as apple pie. But during National Brotherhood Week, National Brotherhood Week, it's National Everyone Smile at One Another Hood Week. Be nice to people who are inferior to you. It's only for a week, so have no fear. Be grateful that it doesn't last all year.
Ladies and gentlemen, live from the Steiner Resort in Pine Woods, New York, Mr. Wide World of News, Mark Halperin.
These people are so mean, man. Just vicious. I've never been vicious. I don't understand it. It's a text I got last night from a friend. We were reading Twitter and reading things about me. And he was amazed, as I am. And what we both have realized for a while is we are now a nation of haters. The presumption in our society and so many interactions, all too often, is a presumption of hate, to hate the other person. I want to talk to you a little bit about the implications of that as I see it for our politics and for our society, and offer up some tentative ideas of how I think we can address it and why we must address it. I think right now, if you look at the challenges we face as a country, I don't think there's anything more important for us to address. To go from being a nation of haters to a nation that has the presumption of grace. The presumption of grace is really what I want to talk about. The presumption of grace means you don't assume that the person who you're in combat with on social media or cable TV or in the Congress of the United States is a bad person. You will never change in our current society away from the presumption of guilt, because that's what people have in our society now. They assume the other person is guilty of being a bad person. But we need to find a way to go from being a society that has a presumption of hatred to a presumption of grace, meaning you afford the other person humanity. You afford them understanding. And it's not just in the easiest cases. It's easy in the easiest cases. It's easy to afford the presumption of grace to your best friend or your significant other when they do something you don't like, usually. It's hard. It's the hardest thing to afford the presumption of grace to someone you detest. Maybe you're a Joe Biden voter and you detest President Trump. That's the hard part. And that's what we need. A presumption of grace, a universal, constant presumption of grace. Now, you heard in that Tom Lehrer song from a few decades back that the obvious is true. This is not a new problem. There has been hatred and a lack of grace throughout not just American history, but human history. Why is it different now? Well, because it's not just about Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump not liking each other. The lack of the presumption of grace is everywhere. It's in our social media and on our cable news. and it's been proliferated by organizations that call themselves news organizations, but I would say are simply purveyors of hate. And it's not just professionals. I'm stunned to this day when people who I used to spend pleasant times in green rooms with, back when I did that, will not afford me a presumption of grace publicly or privately. But I'm more stunned when strangers on social media, again, particularly Twitter, don't want to extend to me a presumption of grace, or to anyone. The conclusion that people leap to right away is that the person they're opposing, that they're facing off with, that they're shouting at in one form or another, doesn't deserve the presumption of grace. Now, I understand hate. To paraphrase the famous Jimmy Carter line, I have felt hate in my heart. I still do, more than I should. After 3 years, when almost all of my public life and much of my private life had been defined to some extent by the lack of presumption of grace, I get it on some level, but I really don't get it. I don't get why it is that people now, almost always, when they're in the public square, have a presumption of hate, not a presumption of grace. Is it what they feel in their heart organically? I find that so hard to believe about most of them. And I know many of the people who show me no grace, and I'm using myself as an example because it's the example I know best. I know they don't hate me. And yet in public, they feel compelled to not show me grace. Is it a tactic? I think for some people it is. It's a tactic to intimidate. It's a tactic to show how tough they are. It's a tactic to feel good about maybe adding some followers on social media. I think a lot of the time what it's a product of is it's a product of wanting to not be beat and feeling that the other side is not going to show a presumption of grace. So they better not do it and look weak. Neera Tanden, I think, feels grace towards other people, but frequently on her Twitter account, she did not afford people the presumption of grace. The president has distorted and warped and accelerated so many things in our society. He doesn't show the presumption of grace very often, to say the least. And I think that's caused a lot of people on the left who, in their heart, feel a presumption of grace towards many, to when they're on the national public town square, show it towards none. Now, what does this have to do with politics and meeting our challenges? Well, for a long time, one of the things I've studied about American politics is the incentives. All of the polarization and all the partisanship, all the negativity, it came from the incentives for politicians and fundraisers and cable TV news hosts and people on social media. The incentive was to be negative and loud, because the louder you were and the more negative you were, the more rewards you got, the less likely you were to lose your next election, the more likely you were to get a book deal. The presumption of grace can't be extended because you look weak. The incentive now is not as so much to be negative as it is to hate. The incentive, the rewards come for those who hate. So if you're a White House correspondent for CNN and you don't afford anyone associated with the Trump administration a presumption of grace, you're rewarded. You get more famous. You get more attention. Maybe you get a raise and a promotion. You saw, if you were watching the graphics put up a little earlier, 2 headlines about me, one from a left-wing publication, one from a right-wing publication. I call them the dailies, the Daily Beast and the Daily Caller. They write a lot of negative stories about me. And again, I'm talking about myself because it's the case I know best. They succeed because at the very center of the ethos of what defines them as organizations, not news organizations, as organizations, is the determined, ostentatious flaunting of an absence of the willingness to afford anyone the presumption of grace. Bill Clinton has a saying that I think applies here. He says, it's better to be strong and wrong in politics often than right and weak. And I think the reason that we see so little of the presumption of grace is because it's now been drilled into people, and not just professionals, but rank and file, grassroots folks around the country, my readers of Wide World of News, that to show someone the presumption of grace is to show weakness. And it is better to be strong and wrong than weak and right. The right thing to do is to try to show everyone except in the most extreme circumstances, the presumption of grace. We will not address the pandemic or the education gap or the policing crisis or the slow economy or anything else we face, I believe, because right now, the absence of the presumption of grace causes everyone to be always at their battle stations, always looking to scorn, criticize, hate, rather than look for solutions, look to work together. Again, I don't want to overstate the case. America has always had conflict. We had a civil war not that long ago. But what's different now is the pervasiveness. It is 24/7. And you look around in periods before, there were prominent voices on the national town square who implicitly and explicitly granted a presumption of grace. Look really hard for them now. You won't find very many, even amongst those in our society who you think would be the most inclined to do it. When Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, says she prays to the president regularly, with all due respect to her, do you think she's extending the presumption of grace when she says that? I single her out because I think she could. I think she could be a leader here. But she, like everyone else in a position of leadership throughout our society, not just in politics, are faced with the implications of what happens if they afford someone their tribe doesn't like a presumption of grace. So I'll tell you the three things I've been thinking about to try to deal with this, because I think it's so important that we do, not just to solve our problems in Congress and in state capitals, not just to have a better educated and better informed electorate, but because it's the right thing to do for our society, for our children and grandchildren, to have a society where the presumption is of grace and not of hate. First thing I want to do is figure out how to form a gang of good, a gang of grace. I don't want Twitter to be dominated by hate. I want Twitter to have people who, when they see someone who's not extending grace to someone else, they reach out and they say, that's not the right thing to do. They support the person. Maybe they show grace to that person. That can happen on the floor of Congress. That can happen on Twitter. That can happen on cable TV. That's going to require a lot of people, because there are a lot of people out there who are animated by the presumption of hate and the presumption of guilt. The second thing I think is important is that we approach this problem, those of you who wish to join me in trying to deal with this, like King and Gandhi. We can't hate the haters. We won't win. Justice won't win. Grace won't win. Confronting someone who's not showing the presumption of grace with grace is, I think, the only way to make this happen. Because I think in their hearts, they'd rather be people of grace. Finally, and I think practically most important, is the leadership. And I say leadership in air quotes. I think that most leaders, heads of universities, heads of companies, politicians, most would like to extend the presumption of grace to people who make mistakes, to people who say the wrong thing, to people who they're in combat with of one sort or another. I think they'd like to. And they'd like to run organizations where that is the rule. But they're so afraid of being seen as weak or out of step with those who dominate the discussion with their presumptions of hatred that they cower. And they pretend that when they make decisions in favor of those who hate versus those who show grace, that they're doing it based on some principle. When they're not. They're doing it because they're afraid. And so the most important thing, I think, from a practical point of view, form our good gang of grace, bring the right ethos to it. But the most important thing is to find a way to give the incentive to these so-called leaders to do not what is strong and wrong, but strong and right. And strong and right begins, and I think ends to some extent, with the presumption of grace. I'm going to talk more about this probably in future town halls, and I'm going to write about it. But I'm going to stop there. I know some of you who saw the first town hall expected me to just be filled with jokes in my opening remarks, but not tonight, because I feel so strongly about this. And while I try to find humor in everything, I think this is a national crisis of the soul. And it's not just a crisis of the soul that harms individuals. It's harming our society, and it's harming our ability to work together as a people in Washington and around the country. I really appreciate all of you joining tonight. You don't have to ask me questions about anything serious. You can ask me about whatever you want. And we'll take some questions and we'll speed through as many as we can. And as I said, you'll be hearing more on this topic from me in the coming days and weeks and months. So thank you again. And I'll turn it over to Paul to start the Q&A.
Thank you, Mark. Our first question's from Frank in New York.
Will Donald Trump be given credit for warp speed as much as he'll be demonized for not being a strong leader and a strong model for its prevention?
Yeah. I mean, he certainly won't be given a lot of credit by CNN White House correspondents anytime soon, or by most of the dominant media. And I think we need to do more reporting to understand exactly what role he played and the organization he said stood up played. But I think there's no doubt that from a substantive point of view, this is a miraculous achievement so far. Let's see if the vaccines are as promised. There's a huge challenge ahead about distribution. And I think when the history is written of all the choices that the president made about how to deal with the pandemic and the things he failed to do, that's going to be a very big part of the story, as it should be, as it has been. And I think their decision to leave the distribution choices up to the states is a questionable one, because my reporting suggests that the states are not particularly ready for this. And you can have the best vaccine in the world, but if it's not distributed correctly, as the Biden folks keep pointing out, you haven't really done much, or you haven't done the last mile, I should say. So we'll see what history says. But in the short term, no, the president will not get much credit for what has been a remarkable achievement and something that he obviously played a big role in. Thank you for your question.
Thank
Paul.
you.
Yes, we have a question from Doug. Doug, are you there?
Hi, Mark.
Good evening.
So my question is this. I have a feeling that there's a plurality of the country that has not had a presidential candidate that really represents what they want to vote for. I feel like we've got a plurality of the country that doesn't have an avenue to get a candidate that they would like to vote for, right?
Yeah.
And my question is, and I think actually part of the frustration that you talked about initially, unfortunately, has been modeled by Trump in the last 4 years, but also
Right.
is just perhaps just a sense of frustration from, I think, a plurality of us who just don't feel like we're getting a candidate, right, that we really want to vote for.
It's what's missing for you, the issue positions or the leadership style or combination?
It's a combination.
I don't think there's any doubt that we have had 2 straight cycles where a lot of people are unhappy with the choices, particularly 4 years ago, but this cycle as well. And that's borne out by the polling. There's no easy answer to it. I'm very skeptical, as I've been for most of my career, that there's going to be a viable independent candidate that might give someone like you more choices.
Yeah.
I think the answer is for people to pay closer attention to the nominating process and to really get involved. I think I'm a big fan of Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and the role they play, because I think the voters there pay close attention. But what I've always said is I'd be interested in taking the disproportionate power those states have away from them if voters in other states were as prepared to understand the issues, to go to town hall meetings with candidates, to really get involved. And so that's what I'm for. I'm for creating so much the kind of voter awareness and interest, volunteering, attending events, really looking at multiple candidates in so many states that the nominating process does change. And I think that would produce potentially, at least, different candidates, better candidates. But I also, on this, I'm relatively optimistic. I think the last 2 cycles were a bit of a fluke. And I think that we all need to hope that we have choices that people think are better choices. And like I said, I think broader involvement, including by people who are less active, because of course the people who get most active in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina are the party activists in those states. So broader involvement in the nominating processes of the 2 major parties by people like you, I think is the best way to try to get both the issues and the style questions addressed in a different way than we've had, unfortunately, for many 2 cycles in a row. Thank you for that, Paul.
Hi, Mark. We've got Betsy on the line with a question.
I was concerned that, we do have the First Amendment right to free speech, but with the news people the pundits, people who aren't journalists, who don't follow any kind of rules of engagement and just lie and spew vitriol and have audiences who follow them, how are we ever going to mend the divide in this country?
Well, I'm for the First Amendment too, and I also know which genies are never going back in which bottles, and so there's going to be a lot of speech out there. And I think the two things that I'm most concerned about, one I talked about in the beginning, I'm concerned about everything being infused with hatred rather than grace. But the other thing is the thing you referenced, which is the lack of facts. And I think Democrats have the high ground right now on the question of which party, in polls, which party seems to have more adherents who believe the truth rather than spin. But neither party has clean hands. And I think that this is where I go back to pretty fundamentals about parents and educators and about leaders in news organizations who really need to be focused on speech that's positive, speech that corrects speech that is factually incorrect, but out in the marketplace. And I think big responsibility, imperfectly executed so far by Twitter and Facebook to try to keep up with that. But I don't think it's ever going to come down to anything as much as it's going to come down to the consumers. I'm going to do a focus group coming up relatively soon and ask folks about this, about why did so many people think that Barack Obama was a Muslim? Not that there's anything wrong with it, but why did they think that when it was factually incorrect? I think we need to get to the bottom of how these things start and how they propagate and how they sustain. But it's going to be up to parents and teachers and peers to try to correct it. But people are just too inclined to believe things that aren't true and too inclined, as I've said, to have a presumption of hate. The biggest thing is leaders. Actual leaders need to step in. Leaders of churches, leaders of synagogues and mosques, leaders of news organizations, leaders of corporations and small businesses, leaders in communities to step in and say, what you're saying isn't true, rather than laughing at it or ignoring it. But it's a tougher problem than we could solve tonight, but I appreciate you raising it. Thank you. Paul.
Peggy Perkins has a question. Peggy, go ahead.
Here's my question, and I'll go back a little bit. Things that I read and hear, more articles are concerned with the Democrats or the left going way too far left. But also what I read and a concern I have is that the Republicans, and I'll ask you the question, do you think the Republicans or the right are going towards authoritarianism?
It's a great question. And I think that one of the problems with journalism, and this is not a new problem, this is not part of what I think is where things have gotten worse, is the press likes to cover conflict and likes to cover, interesting personalities. And Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC, they're interesting. Donald Trump, as I said at the beginning, he's so distorted our politics in so many ways. And he clearly acted in an authoritarian manner in so many fronts. And he was emboldened to do that and empowered to do that by the silence of many and the cheering on of a few others. And I think the question of whether the kind of authoritarianism that Donald Trump practiced as president will continue to be part of the Republican Party will depend on whether he sticks around, and he may well, or if he doesn't, whether other leaders step forward and say, that is not what our party stands for. I think that hangs in the balance. And I think there's no doubt that the Democratic Party has moved on almost every issue to the left in the last 4 years, in part in a reaction to Donald Trump, but I don't think that's the only reason. And I think that's also hanging in the balance here with a president-elect who is more to the center than a lot of the Democratic electorate, not all, but a lot, and certainly more to the center than the Democratic Congress. So I think that as we move into a very complicated 2021, both those issues for both parties, the move to the left by the Democrats, the legacy of authoritarianism from Donald Trump for the Republicans, I think both those things hang in the balance, and I'm not sure which way they'll go, but they definitely are worth watching from a journalistic point of view and from an American point of view. Thank you so much, Paul.
Russ Rogers has a question. Russ, go ahead.
Mark, my question was really, and it's kind of interesting you prefaced this with a speech about hate, because one of the targets of hate from the right has always been the squad, right? And I guess the way I see it is now we have 4 sophomore representatives that bear a lot of the zeitgeist, but how much power do they really have? Number one. And number two, I was watching about the Judiciary Committee, and Dick Durbin seemed to be falling out of favor in terms of Sheldon Whitehouse. Is that kind of a exercise of the power of the squad folks?
Yeah, Russ, it's a great question. And I think that the presumption of grace is really not extended to the members of the squad led by Donald Trump, but in general. I don't think I've met any of the 4 of them. I've seen them on TV and I've watched them closely, and I think some of their policy positions are interesting. Some a lot of people find to be dangerous, but I think that the failure to show them grace is a really, really great example, a stark example of what I'm talking about, and the difficulty we have in our country now of showing grace towards people who are demonized by our tribe. President Trump has demonized them, and that has made it more difficult for them to be afforded grace. But like so many things with Donald Trump, for which he is blamed for creating, that's one of the many examples where he just figured out that that's where the parade was, and he ran to the front of it. He knew that there was a large part of this country, unfortunately, that wanted to show them a presumption of guilt, a presumption of hatred. They've got influence because they get a lot of media attention. And they've also got influence because they represent the aspirations of tens of millions of Americans. And I think the press sometimes, even though the press tends to tilt liberal, I think the press sometimes treats their views like they're fully marginalized in some way. When in fact, although they may not have a majority of support, they've got growing support in the Democratic Party. And again, tens of millions of Americans agree with their positions on many issues. Nancy Pelosi has, I think, often not shown them a presumption of grace, and I think has tried to marginalize them in terms of their power. But they are influential, and I think they'll be more influential if they recruit others who share their views, and if they focus on getting things done, which is difficult in this climate, but getting things done as opposed to just being about rhetoric. I know they've tried. I'm not diminishing their efforts, but I think they're going to have to start succeeding more to be part of legislating as opposed to pointing out issues, which is also an important function of someone in public life. On the Judiciary Committee question, I think that that there's a part of the Democratic Party that does not afford the presumption of grace very often, who are angry about what Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump have done with judges and justices. And I understand their anger, and to go back to the Tom Lehrer lyric that was up on the screen that you may have seen, I don't hate people who hate. I try to afford them the presumption of grace. And yet I see that the anger of the left of what McConnell and Donald Trump did has caused them to not afford the presumption of grace to Dianne Feinstein for giving a hug to her old friend, Lindsey Graham, to not afford the presumption of grace to anyone who doesn't see what they see about how to deal with the judiciary. In reality, having covered both Sheldon Whitehouse and Dick Durbin for a long time, I don't really see much difference between them on the issues germane to the Judiciary Committee, nor do I see much difference in how they would function there. I think in all likelihood, I know a lot of you are interested in the Georgia Senate runoffs. In all likelihood, I think they'd probably not be chairing that committee, but the top Democrat on the committee. And so in the short term, how much of an impact will that have? Not quite sure. But I think that contest is a little bit more about two very ambitious guys than it is about two different visions. Although, again, the perception is among some, people in Washington and some House members for sure, and some Democratic senators, that there is a difference, that Durbin would be more establishment and less willing to engage in the kind of tactics that they saw Mitch McConnell and the president engage in. Russ, thank you for your question. Paul.
Mark, we have John Birch in Kansas with a question. John, you ready?
Yes, I am ready. Thanks. Hi, Mark.
Good evening, John. Nice to see you.
I'm very relieved that we are done with Trump in the White House. We've had a loose cannon on the ship of state, and it's just been horrible on that basis alone for the last 4 years. Question is this Biden's Churchillian moment where he is the right guy just by accident almost at the right time? His gift is schmoozing and persuading people to like him and to come along with things he wants. He's a sort of an undistinguished politician otherwise, but that stands out, and that's what we need right now. So I guess that's one of my questions, if you wanted to elaborate on that thought. Related to it, he's almost certainly going to be a one-term president. So we're going to have power struggles going on in both parties in the background of all of this. So it's going to be a very interesting 4 years. If you would like to comment on any of those, please do.
Sure. You know, it's common to say that he'll be a one-term president, of course, and I know that you know that is a pretty broad assumption. I'm not sure that's true. I think you've seen when his folks have addressed it in the last couple of weeks, they've made it clear that he's not, you know, sort of declaring that he's going to be a one-term president. Senator McCain thought about doing this when he was running for president, on the assumption that voters would be more likely to vote for someone his age, around the age of Joe Biden, if they weren't going to, you know, aspire to 2 terms. I don't think, barring any health issues, I don't think Joe Biden is going to declare himself a one-term president anytime. And if we get past the midterms, no one's going to launch a presidential campaign against an incumbent president who hasn't said he's running, or I doubt more than 1 or 2 people would do that. And so if we get to 2022, towards 2023, and he's feeling good, I think he will run again. My career, one of the things I've learned is I've never seen anyone with a better than decent chance to be their party's nominee for president who didn't run. And an incumbent president's got a pretty good chance to be their party's nominee. So if he stays healthy, I'm not so sure he won't run again in 2024. And in terms of you know, his Churchillian moment, I have the highest hopes, and I hope the whole country does, to afford him the presumption of grace and the hope that he will be the right person for this moment. I think he faces a lot of challenges, including the question of whether he understands the modern Congress, the modern Republican Party, the modern Democratic Party, the modern media landscape, and whether he understands the economy, which has not been a subject of great interest to him compared to some other topics. So in terms of style, if he executes his vision of the style of president that he wants to be and that the country needs, which, as you suggest, I think sync up very well, I think it'll be an extraordinarily fortunate moment for America. But I think that's a real challenge. And I think I know that some of you, based on the questions you sent in, are not the hugest Mitch McConnell fans. I think it's going to be a challenge for him if Democrats don't have a majority in the Senate. I think it's going to be a real challenge for him to apply what he can do to change Mitch McConnell's perspective. Joe Biden has proven himself in winning this nomination, and I would argue in winning the presidency, to be a much better inside player than outside player. And I think the metaphor of being in his basement, which the president tried to turn into something negative, I think was more illustrative of where is Joe Biden comfortable. He's comfortable in those kind of settings. Now, he fancies himself a great orator, but had this been a normal campaign, he was never going to draw hundreds of thousands of people around the country to rallies. Most presidents who are successful are extraordinary at inspiring the grassroots, at reaching across the aisle. My Republican readers, mostly, there's some exceptions, my Republican readers do not afford Joe Biden much of a presumption of grace. Being Churchillian to me means he's got to win them over. Now, Democrats are going to say that's not fair, or, you know, he's not Trump, and so that's all that matters. Not going to be good enough to put pressure on McConnell, to put pressure on the Congress, to build the kind of consensus we need to meet these challenges. I think he is a pretty good example of someone who typically, Donald Trump tested him, but he typically does afford most people a presumption of grace. Not always, but typically. But can he inspire that in others? I think that's the question. If you ask me to say what will show if Joe Biden can rise to the occasion to have his Churchill moment, is can he inspire in others to afford him and their fellow Americans of presumption of grace.
Disappointed that that Biden has not reached out more. I'm from Kansas, which is a very red state, and the rural culture out here needs more attention. And
I agree. I wish he would reach out more to not just red states, but to Trump supporters explicitly.
Exactly.
If he does, he will inspire the presumption of hatred on the part of people on the left. But I think he should do it, and I think he might. But he hasn't done it so far. You know, people talk about him putting a Republican in the government. I was thinking about that today when someone asked me about it. I think that's a symbolic way to try to reach out to Kansas, you know, and play other red places. Imagine if you're the first prominent Republican to take a job in this administration. Who would afford you at that point if you were that person the presumption of grace?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Democrats wouldn't. They'd say, why are we giving this important slot to a Republican? And a lot of Republicans would say, I knew you were a rhino all along. So it's a challenge to reach out. And I hope he can do it. And I think temperamentally and attitudinally, I think he's a good person to do it, but I'm disappointed as you are that he hasn't done much of it so far. John, thank you for the question. Paul.
Here we have a question from Jack.
Thank you, and thank you, Mark, for all that you do to keep us informed and stimulated and knowledgeable about what's going on in the world. Two quick questions. If you're the Democratic candidates running for Senate in Georgia, do you run on a platform of embracing Biden, or do you run on a platform of opposing McConnell and what McConnell has done? The second quick question is, Trump is losing some favorability among Republicans. When do you think, or do you think at some point that he will fall out of favor with Republicans? Because after all, he lost the presidency.
Yeah, thank you for the question and for participating. The Democrats in Georgia are largely embracing Joe Biden. My understanding is they'd like him to come down and do an event. They talk about him on the stump, and they share his agenda regarding healthcare, regarding the pandemic, regarding the economy. So I don't think they're running away from Joe Biden. And of course, Joe Biden won the state. So I don't know that there's any reason why they necessarily would. I still believe, based on my reporting, that Democrats are going to be hard pressed to win both these seats. It could be a split decision, but they'll be very hard pressed to win them both. And I'll be curious to see what happens the rest of the way regarding both Joe Biden and President Trump. You know, Donald Trump has lost some favorability in some polls, but not very much. And most Republicans I talk to say if he wants to stay as the leader of the Republican Party, if he wants to stay as the de facto, not just front runner, but nominee for 2024, he'll be hard. Anyone who wants to stop that would be hard pressed to stop that. And unfortunately, even if you look at the people who are talked about as candidates who have a reputation for, at least on occasion, extending a presumption of grace to others, that's not the culture of this nomination fight right now. You see the people who are out there on the campaign trail already, ones who have gone to Georgia, ones who went to Iowa, New Hampshire. For the most part, without exception, they are all competing to be the next Donald Trump, where the notion of being strong and wrong and not extending the presumption of grace to others is what they see as the path to success. And unfortunately, I think within both parties, that's the case. One extraordinarily valuable thing Joe Biden did in winning the nomination was he did not just sort of stand up to the left of his party on some issues, although he did do that, but he talked about working with Republicans at a time when that is not very popular. Because if you're going to work with somebody, you're at least partially extending them that presumption of grace. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see how long Joe Biden keeps that up if people like Rick Scott, senator from Florida, is pummeling him every day in a way that is not consistent with that presumption of grace. Thank you for your questions. Paul.
Tyson, are you ready with your question, please?
Hey, Mark.
Hey, Tyson. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you. And first of all, thank you for that powerful opening. I do really appreciate that. And that is something that we definitely need in politics and throughout the world right now.
Did you tear up at all during my opening?
I did. It might have been the wind out here in Michigan or my cigar smoke, but I did tear up a little bit and had to wipe a little bit. I'm
betting on the cigar, but thank you for your kind words. Sorry, go ahead.
Quick question with regards to Neera Tanden. And do you think that I'm surprised that the Republicans are attacking her for her Twitter behavior. If that's the only thing that they can find, if it's a policy, but
Right.
being so beholden to Trump and his Twitter antics, they're attacking her for, and I just was wondering what's behind this, or,
Right.
is it with Biden's team?
Yep. Understood. That's a great question. Well, first of all, I don't think that her behavior on Twitter and other places demonstrates much of a presumption of grace, just as the president's behavior on Twitter doesn't. But so I would argue that if your standard is someone is on Twitter filled with hate, they shouldn't be given a position of prominence in our government. I'd respect that position. But if you're a Democrat, I don't think you can say, well, Republicans didn't mind it in Trump, so why do they mind it in her? I would turn it around on both parties and say, just because Republicans tolerated it in Donald Trump, why should our society tolerate it in her? I think there's two things going on, primarily regarding their outspoken criticism of her. I'll add a third as I make it up here on the fly. First, I think senators are kind of thin-skinned, and she, amongst the tweets she deleted, were direct criticisms of senators from the most conservative to the most moderate, and I think they just don't like that, and they don't like the precedent that somebody could use them as social media piñatas, still be accorded a red carpet welcome at the Senate. Two is, I think that they're looking to go after Biden nominees because their base of the Republican Party, the Trump-inspired base, doesn't want a presumption of grace to people Joe Biden would like to have work with him. And so they're trying to sort of establish the notion of we can start going after these people. And she presented, the best early target for that. And then finally, one of the people who's been very lukewarm about her, Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, who is amongst the least Trumpy Republican senators, although he has been largely silent for the last 4 years in the face of the president's behavior. He said he's the chair of he would be chair if the Republicans keep the majority of one of the committees that would have to confirm her. And he raised the issue of judgment and maturity. And I think that's a legitimate thing to say. Now, are we going to say that, for years we said, well, if you smoked marijuana, you couldn't be Senate confirmed. And we got over that. Just demographically, we had to do that or there'd be nobody to fill these jobs. Are we going to say that no one who's shown a lack of presumption of grace on Twitter can be confirmed by the Senate? I, for one, wouldn't rule out. But I think it's unrealistic. But I think what Rob Portman and some others have said is, let's find someone who wasn't, these weren't tweets when she was a teenager 40 years ago. Let's find someone who last year was showing maturity and the presumption of grace on Twitter. And Democrats can say, well, the president didn't do that. And I would say, for my mother, who I see here on this call, wrongs don't make her right. Now, I'm not saying she shouldn't be confirmed, although I don't think she will be. I'm just saying I understand some reasons why there are people who look at what she did on Twitter and say, that's enough. That's enough to say Joe Biden pick somebody else. I can understand that point of view. Thank you, Tyson. Enjoy the cigar. Enjoy the cigar.
Thank you, and thank you for wrapping that actually in to your talk today. That actually makes very good sense. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Paul.
Mary in Syracuse, you have a question.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us and for your question.
If Trump changes his mind and decides not to leave the White House, who is charged with going in and getting him out? And what criminal charges are able to be levied once he is removed?
The Rock and trespassing question. Unlike politicians, I'm normally delighted to engage in hypotheticals, but I'm very confident he's not going to try to stay in there. So I don't think it's going to come to that. I think that'd be super unfortunate. If it did happen, I think the Secret Service would probably be the ones to remove him. And I don't think he'd face any charges for that offense. He might for some other things, but not for that. And I think we've gone through a very fractious 4 years, and I guarantee you the president will do things between now and January 20th that will surprise even experienced Trump watchers. But I don't think sticking around past the deadline is one of them. Thank you for your question. Appreciate it. Paul.
Next up is Mona. Mona, you ready?
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for taking the question. This morning and again tonight, you brought up in the theme of presumption of grace that you would hope, and all Americans should hope, that our president succeeds. But I really was wondering what your definition of succeeding would be.
Well, I think addressing the big problems that we have is one, which would mean passing legislation, not just signing executive orders, although he will do that. But I think I'd like to start with the low-hanging fruit of areas where there's agreement. There's a lot of agreement about what should be in the next COVID relief package. I don't think it's going to pass in December, so I'd like to see that pass really quickly. I'd like to see him get nominees confirmed, and I'd like to see him propose legislation that can pass, maybe not with overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress, because I think that's probably unrealistic, but overwhelmingly bipartisan support in the country. Because I do think there are things on COVID, fighting the pandemic, on the economy, and on infrastructure. And I'd add immigration, where if Joe Biden is willing to not demand a full loaf for the left of the Democratic Party, I think he can find a lot of support in the country in those 4 areas. And I'd like to see him do that. I'd also like to see him, I'll go back to my big theme, I'd like to see him change our culture from a culture where there's a presumption of hate to a presumption of grace. And I'd like to see him restore faith in government, not just that government can solve problems, but that people in government can be trusted to do the right thing. The populist sensibility of being anti-government has been well earned by people in government over the years. And I think he's got the capacity to restore that. And most fundamentally, I'd like him to keep the country safe, and I'd like him to find a way to provide equal opportunity in education in particular for every American. If he can do those things, I'm going to call him a success. Thank you so much. Paul.
Our next question is from Tom.
So I wanted to end, Mark, by asking you about this phrase, the presumption of grace, because it has deeply religious connotations and history. I mean, grace is something of God's quite an unexpected gift of love and acceptance and things. And I'm wondering about that in a political context of I'm curious about that. It's almost like Martin Buber's I and Thou, this deep kind of respect of person to person, which doesn't seem really typical of politics. And maybe, is it more the golden rule or just a basic sense of decency? I'm interested in your choice of that expression.
Right. Well, I absolutely chose a religious word for a purpose, a word involving faith, because for the, 80 million people or so who voted for Joe Biden, very few of them have any instinctual sense to show a presumption of grace to President Trump. And for the 75 million or so people who voted for the president, they don't have that instinct to show the presumption of grace towards Joe Biden or Senator Harris, Vice President-elect Harris. I chose the phrase because it requires suspending your head to some extent. It requires, to some extent, suspending what you feel in your heart. It requires taking a leap, like the leap of faith required to believe, to say, I'm starting from the premise that this is a fellow human being, a fellow son or daughter of God, someone worthy of respect, someone who's got problems and frailties and weaknesses, and someone who I may disagree with. I may have to go to political war or war over the size of the fence in the backyard or over some other issue. I may have to go to war with them, but I'm going to start from a position of treating them empathetically and like a human being, and as someone who I love, someone who I respect, even if it's the hardest person in your life to feel that way about. And I'm not done honing my explanation of it. Tonight's the first time I've ever talked about it, but I believe that it's got to be infused with faith and spirituality, because not only is it contrary to a lot of human nature to have the presumption of grace, but it's so contrary to our current tribal culture, not just in politics, but in all sorts of parts, in all aspects of life that have been touched by Donald Trump and have been touched by our increasingly polarized sensibility. So
yes, it's a radical notion of yours.
It is, but it's easy. And again, I fail every day at doing it, even as I try to make it central to how I approach my personal and professional life. I fail every day, but I'm thinking about it more and more, because the minute you can feel that way, even fleetingly, about someone who hasn't shown it towards you, or doesn't show it towards others, or who stands for something that you vehemently object to, the minute you can do it, even for an instant, you feel differently. You feel the hatred draining out of you. And I believe that if we could all do that, particularly people in public life with prominent voices, we can make a lot of positive change, and change the nature, not just of our discourse and our relationships with each other, but what we can accomplish as a society.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
We've got Joseph fired up and ready to go.
Hey, Mark. It's Joe. Short
Hey,
question,
Joe.
short answer.
Yeah.
What's the best way for an interested young person, independent of party, to get involved?
Practice, practice, practice. Just kidding. Volunteer someplace if you can't get someplace to pay you, where there are three things that are true. The mission is something you believe in. You believe the people there will be willing to spend time teaching you things, and you believe that if you go there and do well, you will be rewarded with more opportunity. Find a place like that, regardless of what it is. It could be a radio station. It could be a campaign. It could be almost anything. Find a place that meets those three conditions. You'll get involved and you'll move up quick.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Last question's from Kiki. Kiki, you ready to go?
You got it. When is the next town hall?
When would you like it to be?
Oh, I don't know. Probably in less than a month.
We'll be doing them more and more. We hope in 2021 and make them maybe even regular. And as I said, experimenting with some different formats. But thank you for that question. Thank you all for spending an hour with us this evening and joining in. I know some of you were expecting more jokes at the beginning, and I'll do my best to work them in next time. But as you can see, I'm pretty fired up about this topic as I grapple with it. I just came up with the phrase a couple days ago, and the concept to put a name to a concept that I've been thinking a lot about. And so I will be talking more about it, but hopefully I'll at least get some knock-knock jokes in as part of that. So have a great evening. Thank you again, and we'll see you at the next town hall.